What's going on, folks? So we're back to talk about this week's episode of Dark Side of the Ring. I believe this is episode 4 or 5, depending on how you want to categorize that first episode, since it was a two-part episode with Chris Benoit. But this week we're talking about the emotional story of Jimmy Superfly Snuka and the death of Nancy Argentino. Again, this episode went back down that path. That kind of goes back down the Chris Benoit path, because I feel like each one of these episodes have carried a different tone. And we're kind of back down to that really emotional driven episode that just, quite frankly, one side of it, you're just filled with emotion. The other side, it's hella cringy, because it's the sensitive nature of what this all entails. Takes you up and down a lot of emotions with it. So Jimmy Super High Snuka is what I'm gonna call him, because outside of just the performer in the ring, an amazing performer, one of the best talents of the time, way before his time, just the abilities that he had, and just the overall performer he was, very much, that legacy, is what I knew of from watching wrestling, or of that time. But hearing about the personal stories of this guy, the combination of the drugs, the arrest, the domestic violence, and just his vibrant personality, as well as the testimonies of others with their personal interactions with him, it's just overall it's devastating, because typically with wrestling, you have these characters who are bigger and larger than life, and sometimes it's just left at that. But now that Vice is doing a lot of these stories where they're pulling back the curtains and going backstage and actually going into these people's personal life, when you add the combination of the two of those together, it's with the real person and the character, it's a lot, because you're just like, wow, I had like really no clue at all. Somebody who is such a character and captivates the crowd so easily could be such a monster in person. And it's that's what this the premise of most of what this episode is talking about. But when you talk about the stories with Jimmy and his girl Nancy, there's so many holes in this story. It's just just from the flat out beginning of the episode, from the information that was already readily available, up until a lot of the other investigation pieces came about, there's just so many holes. And now that, Vice doing a good job of bringing all the proper people to the table to give their testimony about how the first cases were done, the reopening of the cases, relatives and friends all involved, you see, because everyone's, talking from their vantage points, and it all comes together as a pie, but nonetheless, personal stories and testimonies just have this major holes and flaws. So like, that's what's so intriguing about this episode, is because now I feel like the viewers, including myself, now have a full picture, undebatable, almost undisputable picture of everything that happened involving these twos in their relations. But I gotta say, the women that gave their testimonies in this episode are absolutely remarkable, and just as strong as they come, because with the issues involving this very emotional situation, I can only imagine how triggering it is for them. And nonetheless, being able to talk about the situation and how prevalent domestic violence is, and how that's just still an issue in 2020, and having to really talk about it from a really personal standpoint, I just could imagine the type of courage that these women had to display in order to do so. Nonetheless, this resulting in them losing a family member of theirs due to a situation of that nature. So in case you don't know, definitely want to watch the documentary, because I don't want to give too much of the points. But Jimmy was dating Nancy. They were on their way to Allentown, PA for wrestling. This was in 1983. And she was found dead in a hotel room. He was ultimately cooperating with the cops, and ultimately acquitted of any wrongdoing or so forth. He walked away clean. And then there was really no leads or any other witnesses involved with the case. So the case went cold for 30 years, with no one being arrested and no other leads or anything. He gave a wonky story about it that changed multiple times. And, you can hear all about that whenever you watch it. But the biggest thing about this is that 1983, and much like any case back then, just was the lack of technology and the lack of resources in order to conduct a proper investigation. So why, one of the lead detectives on the case was, part of this documentary, I feel like he answered truthfully and really knowledgeable to the scenario as best as he can, because he, like he said, he had to work with what was available. And although more information came out later, it's more the case of like, what could he have done, because he really didn't have what we have now then. So I thought that was a really interesting take as well. But then, like I said, 30 years later, so, this is what's really interesting about this. So 30 years later of her death, there was an autopsy report uncovered. And this was done, and like, by all means and accounts, good God, the autopsy report is just, once they started reading, I was locked into this episode. I didn't even, again, from the first part of this episode of knowing what was happening to the autopsy report to being uncovered for the first time, is just, at the current time of when, I'll get to it, but at the time that information was available for everybody, and the fact that no one had known about it, and the information that detailed in the autopsy, it's just mind-blowing. It's just mind-blowing. And it was such vital information and evidence that it ultimately resulted into the case being reopened. But, Adam Clark, who's a journalist for the Morning Cow, his coverage and efforts did something remarkable that's just truly never really been done. And that's truly getting a case reopened. That's just powerful, because as much as, there's, other things that happen in the world where new evidence comes about, 9 times out of 10 the case doesn't get reopened, but he was able to do so. And from just a journalist and an article to it being on the front of a paper to ultimately providing some type of peace for the family, it's just a really powerful thing that Adam was able to do. But along while that was kind of happening too, Jimmy also put out a book. And I remember when the book came out, and the biggest thing from the book, it wraps around Vince McMahon. And much like Vince McMahon right now, these behind doors meetings and deals being done to get things done, it's this shady business. And, there's not a lot of information about what happened in that meeting then. But it's just, Vince McMahon, the businessman he is, he just seems to be able to get things done. And, as far as I'm under the impression that meeting was all about the protection of his biggest star in Jimmy. So maybe there was some money exchange or some deal done that ultimately got, a lot of the momentum going as far as people targeting Jimmy again to decease. So who knows what happened to me, but it's the details of that is in Jimmy's book, but they brought that up in the documentary as well. But then again, like I said, later on after that, the DA ended up getting the case reopened. It got a lot of attention, and ultimately they was able to charge him and bring him to court. And this is a really interesting thing, because although he was charged for the murder or a wrongful death, I believe it was one or the other, he couldn't stand trial because he was just medically and mentally unfit, because of his dementia, because of just the number of brain injuries that he suffered throughout his career and being a performer. So ultimately, the result of that ended up being that the trial, he was ended up being what's the word I'm looking for? He was deemed so he's deemed medically unfit to stand trial. So they just had to quit the case. But 10 days later after that ruling, he then died. So the thing is that, the family was able to get, however you want to count this, some peace, because they was able to see him, stand trials for the things of his past, or stand in front of the court for the things of his in the past. but ultimately they won't be able to get the resolution that they want because of his death. So it's a bitter taste, but nonetheless, it brought some peace, something positive after this family suffered and had to really grieve this tragedy for 30 years plus. But like I said, this documentary, this episode was just really emotional. It took you all over the place. It was very knowledgeable. The big thing with Sanford 2, who's another performer who was in the car ride with Jimmy and Nancy on the way to Allentown, that people didn't even know that there was a third person in the car, and that he had no clue of Jimmy's story about it only being just him and Nancy in the car. The contradictions in that is just kind of mind blowing. That says a lot about the big loopholes and just holes period that was involved with this investigation and story. So I will say this, for everybody that was involved with it outside of Jimmy, obviously the wrestlers and the investigators, the Undertaker, the families, all that other stuff, I feel like everyone was really true to their statements and their knowledge of the situation, and I feel like they provided as best as they could. But ultimately, it all points to just Jimmy and his just wrongdoing and just constant pattern of abuse that ultimately resulted in Nancy's death at the age of 23, way too young, and no one deserves to be taken out like that. But I can't stress enough, you should definitely check out this episode, because I think that it is truly it's really well done, and Vice is on a mean streak right now. We're really doing amazing episodes for season 2 of Dark Side of the Ring. But anyway, once you check it out, definitely come back here and let me know what your thoughts is, and we'll be back next week for next week's episode. Big old bell.